My wife's phone rang. I answered thinking it was work. A man whispered, "You left your underwear here again." I stayed silent. He giggled, "I love you so much." I quickly ended the call. The voice? It wasn't a stranger. It was family. You know how they say life can change in an instant? Yeah. Well, whoever came up with that gem of wisdom clearly had a crystal ball, because mine went from suburban dad bliss to Jerry Springer episode faster than you can say plot twist from hell. There I was doing what every red-blooded American husband does on a Tuesday evening, standing at the kitchen sink like some domesticated caveman, scrubbing the remnants of our family dinner off plates that cost more than my first car. The kids had demolished their mac and cheese like tiny Vikings, leaving behind a battlefield of orange cheese dust and the kind of mess that makes you question your life choices. But hey, that's parenthood for you. Equal parts joy and wondering why you didn't invest in paper plate stock. My wife Sarah had bounced out about 20 minutes earlier, muttering something about needing milk and bread from the store. Classic grocery store run that somehow always turns into a 2-hour expedition involving organic kale, artisanal sourdough, and whatever Pinterest told her we absolutely couldn't live without this week. She'd left her phone sitting on the granite counter like it was radioactive waste, which let me tell you should have been my first red flag. Sarah and her iPhone had a relationship more committed than most marriages. The woman checked that thing more often than a teenage girl stalking her crush's Instagram. So there I am, elbow deep in sudsy water when her phone starts buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. The caller ID just showed a number, no name, no photo of some soccer mom from the PTA or her sister calling to complain about her latest dating disaster. Just digits, cold anonymous digits that somehow felt wrong from the get-go. Now, normally I wouldn't touch Sarah's phone with a 10-foot pole. Not because I'm some saint or anything, but because the last time I accidentally answered it, I got stuck in a 40-minute conversation with her cousin about her cat's digestive issues. Trust me, there are some things you can unhear and Whisker's bowel movements top that list. But something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the persistent buzzing, or maybe it was that little voice in the back of my head. You know, the one that usually tells you not to eat gas station sushi or trust politicians. Whatever it was, I found myself drying my hands on the dish towel and reaching for the phone. "Hello," I said, trying to sound casual, like I answered my wife's phone all the time instead of treating it like it might explode if I looked at it wrong. What came next wasn't the cheerful voice of Sarah's book club asking about next week's meeting, or her boss wondering if she could cover an extra shift. No, what I heard was a man's voice, low and intimate, dripping with the kind of familiarity that made my stomach drop, like I just missed the last step on a flight of stairs. "You left your underwear here again." The words hit me like a freight train loaded with WTF. My brain did that thing where it tries to process information that doesn't compute, like when you see a stop sign that's blue instead of red. This had to be a wrong number. Had to be, because the alternative was that some dude was talking to my wife about her underwear, and that thought made me want to punch something expensive. But then came the soft giggle, not a nervous laugh or an oops, wrong number chuckle. This was the kind of laugh that said secrets, that said inside jokes, that said things I really didn't want to think about. It was followed by 3 little words that might as well have been delivered by a wrecking ball to my chest. "I love you so much." My grip on the phone tightened until I thought the screen might crack under the pressure. My ears were burning like someone had set them on fire, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. The voice on the other end and wasn't done either. There was more, something about missing her, about when they could see each other again, about how he couldn't wait to hold her. I hung up, just straight up ended the call like I was hanging up on a telemarketer trying to sell me extended car warranties. But unlike those calls, this one didn't leave me feeling victorious. Instead, I stood there staring at Sarah's phone like it had just grown fangs and started hissing at me. The device sat there on the counter, innocent as a sleeping baby, giving no indication that it had just delivered the kind of news that makes grown men question everything they thought they knew about their lives. The screen went dark, but I kept staring at it, waiting for it to ring again, dreading that it might, hoping that it wouldn't. My mind was racing faster than a NASCAR driver on Red Bull. This had to be a mistake. Had to be. Maybe it was a prank call. Maybe it was some kid with too much time on his hands and a sick sense of humor. Maybe it was a wrong number and some poor bastard somewhere was wondering why his girlfriend wasn't answering her phone. But deep down in that place where your gut lives and tells you uncomfortable truths you don't want to hear, I knew better. The voice wasn't that of a stranger. It wasn't some random dude who dialed the wrong number. No, this voice had something that made my blood run cold. Familiarity. Not just the familiarity of someone Sarah knew, but someone I knew. The inflection, the way he said certain words, even that damn laugh, they all triggered something in my memory that I wasn't ready to face. I set the phone down carefully like it might explode if I moved too fast. My hands were shaking and I realized I was holding my breath. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too quiet, too normal for what had just happened. The half-washed dishes in the sink, Chloe's drawing stuck to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like farm animals. The grocery list Sarah had written in her neat handwriting. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. That's when it hit me like a punch to the gut. I was standing in my own kitchen, in my own house, holding my own wife's phone, and I just heard another man tell her he loved her. The American dream had just turned into the American nightmare, complete with a soundtrack of my own heartbeat drowning out the hum of the refrigerator. You know what they say about sleeping dogs? Well, whoever came up with that brilliant piece of wisdom clearly never had their entire world flipped upside down by a phone call. Because let me tell you, when you suspect your wife is cheating on you with your own flesh and blood, sleep becomes about as elusive as finding a decent pizza in a gas station. That night, I lay in bed next to Sarah like I was sharing a mattress with a complete stranger, listening to her breathe, and wondering how long this had been going on right under my nose. She slept like a baby, the kind of peaceful, guilt-free slumber that apparently comes with being a world-class actress. Meanwhile, I was staring at the ceiling like it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries, my mind running through scenarios that would make a soap opera writer jealous. Every little sound she made, every shift in her breathing, every unconscious movement had me analyzing like I was some kind of bedroom detective. When morning finally crawled around, and trust me, it took its sweet time, I decided to channel my inner Sherlock Holmes. Not the brilliant deduction part, mind you, but the obsessive investigation part. If Sarah was playing games, then two could play that particular sport. Time to test the waters and see just how deep this deception went. I started small, like a fisherman testing the current before casting the big line. Over coffee and toast that tasted like cardboard mixed with betrayal, I threw out some casual questions. You know, the kind of innocent spousal interrogation that happens in kitchens across America every morning. Except usually it's about who forgot to take out the trash, not who's sleeping with the enemy. So, what's your day looking like? I asked, watching her face over my coffee mug like I was studying for a final exam in advanced detection. She rattled off her usual routine. Work, grocery store again, because apparently we were always one banana away from starvation. Maybe lunch with her sister. All delivered with the kind of casual confidence that made me wonder if she'd been practicing in the mirror. Her eyes never quite met mine, though. That was new. Sarah had always been the type to maintain eye contact during conversations. Even when she was telling me about her day at the DMV or describing some reality TV drama, I couldn't care less about lunch with Jennifer. I pressed, naming her sister like I was testing a theory. Haven't seen her in a while. How's she doing with the divorce? Oh, you know, Jin, Sarah said with a laugh that sounded just a fraction too forced. Still trying to decide if she wants to take Derek for everything he's worth or just half of everything he's worth. She was good. I'll give her that. The response was perfectly Sarah, complete with the kind of casual sister gossip that usually made my eyes glaze over. But there was something off about the timing, like she paused for just a millisecond too long before answering. Or maybe I was becoming one of those paranoid husbands who sees conspiracy theories in their wife's breakfast choices. Throughout the day, I found myself becoming the kind of guy I used to make fun of, checking her location on the Find My Friends app like some kind of digital stalker, noting when she was online versus when she said she was in meetings, mentally cataloging every detail that seemed even slightly out of place. It was exhausting and pathetic and necessary all at the same time. The real test came that evening when our 6-year-old daughter Chloe was at the kitchen table, tongue sticking out in concentration as she worked on her math homework. Addition and subtraction problems that seemed laughably simple compared to the emotional calculus I was trying to figure out in my own head. There's something beautifully innocent about watching a kid struggle with what's 7 plus 5 when you're sitting there trying to solve what's marriage plus betrayal divided by family dysfunction. Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter, the same counter where it had delivered yesterday's bombshell. This time though, I was ready. I watched Sarah's reaction like a hawk studying a mouse, looking for any telltale signs of guilt or excitement or whatever emotion people feel when their secret lover sends them a text. She glanced at the phone and for just a split second, I swear I saw something flicker across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something. Then she looked at me, caught me watching her, and that something vanished faster than free samples at Costco. Work, she said, holding up the phone like it was evidence in her defense. Steve wants to know if I can cover the morning shift tomorrow. Steve was her manager, a guy in his 50s who wore polo shirts tucked into khakis and talked about golf like it was a religion. The most exciting thing Steve had probably ever done was order the spicy mustard instead of regular. If Steve was texting Sarah at 8 o'clock at night about shift coverage, then I was the Queen of England. On a Tuesday night, I asked, keeping my voice casual while my internal BS detector started shrieking like a smoke alarm. That's late for Steve to be thinking about scheduling. Sarah's response was a perfect example of what I was starting to recognize as her new normal. Just plausible enough to be believable, just vague enough to avoid details that could be checked later. You know how he is about planning ahead, she said with an eye roll that would have won her an Emmy if this was a performance. Plus, Janet called in sick and he's probably panicking about coverage. She texted back quickly, her fingers moving across the screen with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from frequent use. Then she set the phone face down on the counter. Another new habit I'd started noticing. The old Sarah used to leave her phone face up, screen visible like she had nothing to hide. This new Sarah treated her phone like it was classified government documents. "Mommy, can you help me with this one?" Chloe's voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter, reminding me that in the middle of this adult disaster, there was still a little girl who needed help with homework and bedtime stories and all the normal parent stuff that keeps the world spinning. Sarah immediately shifted into mom mode. All warmth and patience as she helped Chloe work through a particularly tricky subtraction problem. Watching them together, Sarah's genuine smile as she praised Chloe for getting the right answer. Chloe's giggle when Sarah made a joke about numbers being sneaky made my chest ache in ways I couldn't describe. This was my family. These were the people I'd built my whole adult life around. And somewhere in the middle of homework help and bedtime routines, the foundation had started cracking without me noticing. The worst part was watching Sarah slip seamlessly between roles, devoted mother 1 minute, potential cheating wife the next, all while maintaining the kind of performance that would make Broadway stars jealous. They say the devil's in the details, but whoever came up with that gym clearly never went through their cheating wife's personal belongings while she was belting out show tunes in the shower. Because let me tell you, the devil isn't just in the details. He's practically running a damn headquarters operation complete with receipts, bank statements, and enough evidence to make a divorce attorney's eyes light up like slot machines hitting jackpot. The next morning started like every other morning in our picture-perfect suburban life. Sarah hummed while making coffee. Actual humming like some kind of Disney princess who'd just discovered woodland creatures could do her hair. She kissed me goodbye with the same lips that had probably been whispering sweet nothings to someone else, grabbed her purse, and headed off to what she claimed was work, but could have been a CIA Black Ops site for all I knew at this point. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway was my starting gun. I'd never been the snooping type. Hell, I used to make fun of those paranoid husbands on TV who went through their wives' stuff like amateur forensic investigators. But life has a funny way of turning you into exactly the kind of person you used to mock. Usually right around the time your world implodes like a controlled demolition. I started with her purse, which she'd left sitting on the kitchen counter like some kind of leather landmine. Sarah's purse was legendary in our household. A black hole of receipts, expired coupons, lip balms, and enough random crap to stock a convenience store. Chloe used to joke that mom's purse was bigger than her backpack, and she wasn't wrong. Digging through it felt like archaeological excavation, except instead of discovering ancient civilizations, I was uncovering evidence of modern betrayal. Receipt after receipt, all neatly folded and stuffed into various compartments like she was keeping records for the IRS. But these weren't receipts for groceries or gas or the usual domestic expenses that married couples rack up, like participation trophies. No, these were receipts for places I'd never been. Restaurants I'd never heard of. Located in parts of town that might as well have been on Mars for all the time I'd spent there. High-end places, too. The kind of joints where appetizers cost more than our usual dinner for four. And the waiters probably have graduate degrees in wine pairing. La Bernardine. I read off one receipt trying to pronounce it like I hadn't failed high school French. $67 for lunch. $67 for lunch. I could feed my family for 2 days on $67. And Sarah was dropping the kind of cash on what the receipt described as pan-seared halibut with truffle risotto. The same woman who complained when I suggested we splurge on name-brand cereal was apparently living it up like some kind of Food Network celebrity. But that was just the appetizer. Pun intended. The main course came when I found the hotel receipts tucked away in a side pocket like dirty little secrets. Not just any hotels either, but boutique places downtown with names like the Metropolitan and Harbor View Suites. Places that charge by the hour what we spend on groceries by the week. My hands started shaking as I read the dates. Business trips that I remembered her taking, overnight conferences that had seemed perfectly legitimate at the time. Except now I was looking at evidence that these conferences involved room service champagne and Egyptian cotton sheets instead of PowerPoint presentations and continental breakfast. The kicker, some of these receipts were signed by someone else. Not Sarah's neat, careful signature that I'd seen on birthday cards and mortgage documents, but a man's handwriting. Sloppy, confident strokes that spelled out a name I recognized from family Christmas cards and wedding invitations. Marcus, my own goddamn brother. Seeing his name on those receipts was like getting punched in the gut by reality wearing brass knuckles. This wasn't some stranger sweeping my wife off her feet with romantic dinners and luxury hotels. This was my brother, the same guy who used to give me wedgies and steal my lunch money, who'd borrowed $5,000 from me last year to get back on his feet after his own divorce. I moved on to her dresser, rifling through drawers that used to be off limits, not because they were forbidden, but because they were boring. Underwear, socks, the usual collection of female necessities that I'd never paid attention to because, frankly, my wife's sock drawer wasn't exactly riveting entertainment. But now everything was evidence. I found a jewelry box tucked away behind her winter sweaters. Not the jewelry box that sat on top of the dresser with the rings and necklaces I'd given her over the years, but a smaller one hidden away like contraband. Inside was a bracelet I'd never seen before. Delicate and expensive looking with a charm that had an inscription too small to read without squinting. M+S forever. M+S Marcus plus Sarah. Forever. I wanted to throw the damn thing across the room, but instead I just sat there on the edge of our bed. The bed we'd picked out together. The bed where we'd conceived our daughter. The bed where we'd had countless conversations about our future, holding evidence of my wife's affair with my brother like it was radioactive waste. The financial records were stored in a filing cabinet in what Sarah optimistically called our home office, but was really just a spare bedroom with a desk and a computer that we used to pay bills and store Christmas decorations. Sarah was meticulous about record keeping, a trait I'd always appreciated during tax season, but now made my investigation embarrassingly easy. Bank statements going back months told a story that made my chest tighten with each page. Regular withdrawals, always in cash, always in amounts that wouldn't trigger any automatic alerts, but were too large to be lunch money. Monthly transfers to an account I didn't recognize, labeled simply as personal expenses in Sarah's neat handwriting. But the real smoking gun was buried in a folder marked miscellaneous because apparently that's where you file evidence of your secret life. Transfer records to an account under Marcus' name. Not loans, not gifts, but regular payments with memo lines that made my blood run cold. Hotel expenses, dinner reimbursement, weekend getaway. My wife wasn't just having an affair with my brother. She was financing it using our joint savings, money we'd set aside for Chloe's college fund and family vacations to pay for romantic rendezvous with the man who'd stood up at our wedding and toasted our eternal happiness. You know that moment in horror movies when the protagonist knows they should run, but instead they creep deeper into the haunted house. Well, turns out real life has its own version of that scenario, except instead of ghosts and demons, you're dealing with text messages and phone logs that are about to destroy everything you thought you knew about your marriage. And just like those movie characters, I knew I should stop digging, should preserve what little sanity I had left, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to see how deep this rabbit hole went, even if it led straight to hell. Finding the paper trail had been like discovering the tip of an iceberg. Impressive and damaging, sure, but I had this sinking feeling that the real wreckage was still hidden beneath the surface. The smoking gun, the absolute proof that would turn my suspicions from paranoid husband territory into cold, hard, divorce court-ready evidence, was sitting right there in Sarah's phone. The same phone that had started this whole nightmare, now taunting me from the kitchen counter like some kind of digital Pandora's box. The opportunity came when Sarah announced she was taking a shower. One of those luxurious 20-minute affairs that involved enough steam to rival a sauna and more beauty products than a department store cosmetics counter. She'd left her phone charging on the nightstand, face down as usual, like it was trying to hide from me. My heart was pounding like I was about to defuse a bomb instead of just checking my wife's text messages. Funny how betrayal turns you into a criminal in your own home, skulking around like some kind of domestic spy while your daughter watches cartoons downstairs and your wife scrubs away whatever guilt she might actually feel about destroying your family. I picked up the phone with hands that were shaking worse than a paint mixer at Home Depot. Sarah had never been big on security. Her passcode was Chloe's birthday because apparently she thought potential phone thieves wouldn't be able to guess that the woman with family photos plastered all over her lock screen might use her kid's birth date as a password. Under normal circumstances, her trusting nature was one of the things I loved about her. Right now, it was making my investigation easier than it had any right to be. The phone unlocked on the first try and I was immediately hit with a wall-up of notifications that made my stomach drop like a stone thrown off a bridge. Missed calls, unread texts, voicemails, all from numbers I didn't recognize and some that I did. But it was the messaging app that really caught my attention, showing preview texts that made my blood run cold, even in their truncated form. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible. When can we? I opened the messages app like I was handling live explosives, half expecting the phone to burst into flames or start screaming accusations at me. What I found was worse than anything I'd imagined during my sleepless night of paranoid speculation. Deleted conversations, lots of them. Sarah had been cleaning house, wiping away evidence like she was some kind of digital janitor. But here's the thing about technology. It's both a blessing and a curse. Sure, she could delete the conversations, but she couldn't delete the fact that they'd existed in the first place. The phone kept records, little breadcrumbs of digital infidelity that painted a picture clearer than any Renaissance masterpiece. Thread after thread of deleted conversations, all with the same contact. No name, just a number, but a number I was starting to recognize from all those missed calls and hotel receipts. The timestamps told their own story. Late night texts when I was sleeping next to her. Afternoon messages sent during her lunch breaks. Early morning exchanges that happened while I was making coffee and packing Chloe's school lunch. But Sarah wasn't quite as tech-savvy as she thought she was because buried in the drafts folder, that digital graveyard where unfinished thoughts go to die, I found the mother lode, messages she'd typed but never sent, like a diary of her affair written in real time. I can't keep lying to him like this. What if he finds out about us? I feel terrible, but I can't stop. And then the one that made my knees weak and my vision blur around the edges. Marcus, I think I'm falling in love with you, Marcus. There it was, spelled out in black and white. No room for interpretation or wishful thinking. Not some random coworker or mysterious stranger, but my own brother. The man who taught Chloe how to ride a bike, who'd helped me install our deck last summer, who'd been coming to our house for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations while secretly planning to blow up my life from the inside. I kept scrolling through the drafts like some kind of masochist, finding message after message that she'd typed, but apparently thought better of sending. Plans for weekend getaways, complaints about having to pretend when I was around, discussions about when they could finally be together without hiding. The worst part wasn't even the content of the messages. It was the timestamps. This had been going on for months. Not a recent fling or a moment of weakness, but a sustained calculated betrayal that had been happening right under my nose while I was worrying about mortgage payments and whether we needed to refinance the house. Every family dinner where Marcus had sat at my table, every time he'd hugged Sarah goodbye a little too long, every occasion where I'd thought they were just being friendly siblings-in-law, it had all been a performance. They'd been laughing at me probably. Poor stupid husband who couldn't see what was happening in his own house with his own wife, with his own brother. The sound of the shower turning off upstairs made me jump like I'd been caught robbing a bank. I quickly closed the messages and put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, face down on the nightstand like a guilty secret, keeping watch over our bed. By the time Sarah emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in the fluffy robe I'd bought her last Christmas, I was back downstairs pretending to read the morning paper. But the words on the page might as well have been written in ancient Greek because all I could see were those deleted messages, those drafted confessions, those digital love letters to my own damn brother. Feel better? I asked when she came into the kitchen, and the irony of the question wasn't lost on me. Here I was asking if she felt better after her shower when what I really wanted to know was how she managed to live with herself after what I'd just discovered. Much, she said, kissing the top of my head like she was still the loving wife instead of a woman who'd been financing secret romantic getaways with my brother. You seem tense. Everything okay? Everything okay? Right. My wife was having an affair with my brother, using our savings to pay for their romantic escapades, and lying to my face with the kind of skill that would make professional con artists jealous. But sure, everything was just peachy. You ever watch one of those nature documentaries where they show predators stalking their prey? The way the lion crouches in the tall grass, muscles coiled and ready, while the unsuspecting gazelle just keeps grazing like it's living in some Disney movie where everyone gets along and nobody gets eaten. Well, that evening I felt like I was watching the human version of that exact scenario. Except I couldn't tell who was the predator and who was dinner because there I was sitting at my own kitchen table when Marcus walked through my front door like he owned the place. Same cocky grin he'd worn since we were kids. Same casual wave. Same hey bro greeting that used to make me smile but now made me want to introduce his face to my fist. He was carrying a bottle of wine, some fancy red that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and wearing that ridiculous polo shirt that made him look like he was about to tee off at the country club instead of having dinner with the family. He was systematically destroying. The audacity was breathtaking. Really? Here was a guy who'd been sleeping with my wife, spending my money, and planning a future that didn't include me. And he had the balls to show up at my house with wine and small talk like he was some kind of beloved family member instead of a backstabbing snake in khakis. Sarah, he called out like he was announcing his arrival to his girlfriend instead of his brother's wife. I brought that Cabernet you mentioned. The one from that little winery, I mean the one I heard you talking about. Nice save, Romeo. Real smooth. If I hadn't already seen the evidence, that little slip might have flown right over my head. But now, I was listening to everything with the intensity of a FBI wiretap, cataloging every word, every glance, every microscopic interaction that proved what I already knew, but wasn't ready to confront yet. Sarah practically floated into the room when she heard his voice, and watching them greet each other was like witnessing a masterclass in acting. The casual hug that lasted just a fraction too long. The way her hand lingered on his arm when she thanked him for the wine. The shared look that passed between them for maybe half a second before they remembered. I was standing right there watching this performance like the world's most uncomfortable audience of wine. You didn't have to bring wine, Sarah said, but her tone suggested she was pleased he had. I made that roast you love so much. The roast he loves. Not the roast we all love or the roast that's good for family dinners. The roast he loves because apparently Sarah had been taking requests from her lover and serving them up at family dinner like some kind of twisted room service. Smells incredible, Marcus said, taking a deep breath like he was savoring more than just the aroma of pot roast. You always did know your way around the kitchen. Always did. Like he'd been sampling her cooking in contexts that didn't involve family gatherings. Like he'd been getting private tastings that came with more than just dinner rolls and small talk. Meanwhile, Chloe was at the table with her coloring book, completely oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around her. She was working on some elaborate masterpiece involving unicorns and rainbows, humming under her breath the way kids do when they're completely absorbed in something that makes perfect sense to them and no sense to anyone else. Watching her color while her mother and uncle performed their little charade made my chest tight with a kind of protective rage I'd never experienced before. This was my daughter's world they were playing with. Her sense of normal, her understanding of family, her belief that the adults in her life were trustworthy and stable and not secretly destroying everything she thought she could count on. She looked up at Marcus with the same adoration she'd always had for her fun uncle, the guy who brought her presents and taught her card tricks, and made her laugh until she got the hiccups. Uncle Marcus, she squealed, abandoning her crayons to run over for a hug. Look what I drew. It's a unicorn flying over a castle. Marcus scooped her up like he was auditioning for Father of the Year instead of Home Wrecker of the Century, spinning her around while she giggled and showed off her artwork. He praised her drawing with the kind of enthusiasm that would have seemed genuine if I didn't know he was a lying, cheating piece of garbage who was currently destroying her family from the inside out. That's amazing, kiddo, he said, setting her down and examining the drawing like it was headed for the loft. You're getting so good at staying in the lines. Pretty soon you'll be better than all those famous artists. Chloe beamed with pride, and I wanted to grab her and run. Just pick up my daughter and get her as far away from this toxic performance as possible. Somewhere she wouldn't have to find out that Uncle Marcus was the reason Mommy and Daddy were going to get divorced. Somewhere she could keep believing that family stayed together and adults told the truth and unicorns were the most complicated thing she'd have to worry about. Dinner was a special kind of torture that should probably be studied by psychologists as a new form of enhanced interrogation. There we all were sitting around the table like some Norman Rockwell painting of American family values while I tried not to choke on my food and my rage simultaneously. Sarah served the meal with the kind of domestic pride that would have been sweet if it wasn't all part of her elaborate deception. Marcus complimented everything from the seasoning on the roast to the way she'd arranged the vegetables. And Sarah glowed under his praise like a teenager with her first crush. I sat there cutting my meat and plotting various scenarios that ranged from confronting them both right there at the dinner table to quietly documenting everything for the inevitable custody battle. The silence from my end of the table was apparently noticeable because Chloe kept asking me if I was okay and why I wasn't talking much. Daddy's just tired, sweetheart, Sarah explained, reaching over to pat my hand in what probably looked like welly concern but felt like a patronizing dismissal. He's been working really hard lately. Working hard. Right. While I've been working hard to provide for our family, she'd been working hard to betray it. The irony was so thick you could cut it with the same knife I was currently gripping a little too tightly. There's something about putting a 6-year-old to bed that makes you realize how fragile innocence really is. Chloe's bedtime routine was sacred in our house. The same sequence of teeth brushing, pajama selection, and story time that had been our nightly ritual since she was old enough to have opinions about which stuffed animals needed to sleep on the bed versus which ones could handle floor duty. That night, as I read her good night moon for probably the 1000th time, her little hand curled in mine, I felt like I was saying goodbye to more than just another day. She fell asleep to the sound of my voice telling her about the quiet old lady whispering hush, completely unaware that downstairs her mother was probably whispering entirely different things to her uncle. The thought made my stomach churn as I kissed her forehead and turned off her nightlight, leaving her to dream about whatever 6-year-olds dream about. Probably unicorns and ice cream and a world where the adults in her life don't lie to each other with the skill of professional con artists. When I came back downstairs, Marcus had finally left. Thank God, because I'm not sure I could have maintained my composure much longer. The guy had spent the entire evening acting like he was doing me some kind of favor by gracing us with his presence, telling stories, and cracking jokes, and playing the role of beloved family member while I sat there knowing he'd been playing an entirely different role when I wasn't around. Sarah was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher, humming the same tune she'd been humming all week. Probably some song he'd introduced her to during one of their romantic rendezvous. The sight of her there looking so domestic and innocent made something inside me finally snap. All the evidence, all the lies, all the late-night phone calls and secret bank transfers and deleted text messages. It all came rushing back like a dam bursting. I cornered her between the kitchen island and the sink, not physically threatening, but definitely blocking any easy escape routes she might have been considering. The fluorescent light above the sink cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look like a stranger, which I was beginning to realize she basically was. "We need to talk," I said. And even to my own ears, My voice sounded different, colder, like someone had replaced my usual tone with something that belonged in a courtroom or a police interrogation room. Sarah looked up from the plate she was rinsing. And for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Not surprise exactly, but the kind of weariness that comes when you know you've been caught, but you're not sure how much the other person knows. "Sure," she said, trying to sound casual while her hands kept moving dishes around like she was rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. "What's on your mind?" "What's on my mind? Jesus, where did I even start?" The phone call that had started this whole nightmare. The hotel receipts with my brother's signature. The bank transfers funding their romantic getaways. The deleted text messages declaring her love for the man who'd stood up at our wedding. "Yesterday," I said, watching her face like I was studying a map to buried treasure when you were at the store. "Your phone rang." The plate in her hand slipped just slightly, barely noticeable, unless you were watching for exactly that kind of tell. She recovered quickly, setting it in the dishwasher with the kind of careful precision that screamed guilt louder than any confession. "Oh," she said, and the single word was so loaded with false innocence, it should have come with a warning label. "Who was it?" "That's what I'm hoping you can tell me," I said, stepping closer. Close enough to see the tiny muscle in her jaw twitching. Close enough to smell the perfume she'd started wearing recently. Something expensive and unfamiliar that definitely hadn't come from the drugstore where she usually bought her beauty supplies. I answered it. I continued, letting each word drop like stones into still water. "Someone called looking for you." "A man." Sarah's face went through a series of micro-expressions that would have been fascinating to watch under different circumstances. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like relief before settling on indignation. The default emotion of people who've been caught red-handed but are going to try to brazen their way out of it anyway. "You answered my phone," she said. And the way she said it, you'd think I'd committed some kind of cardinal sin instead of just picking up a ringing device in my own kitchen. That's a violation of privacy. Privacy. The woman who'd been financing secret affairs with our joint bank account wanted to lecture me about privacy. The irony was so thick you could practically taste it. "Privacy," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air between us like a bad smell. "That's interesting. You want to talk about privacy while some guy is calling you about your underwear." Her face flushed red, then drained white, then flushed red again, like she couldn't decide which shade of guilt worked best with her complexion. She opened her mouth, probably to launch into some elaborate explanation involving wrong numbers and mistaken identity, but I cut her off before she could spin another web of "He said he loved you, Sarah." Those were his exact words. "I love you so much. And you know what?" I recognized his voice. That's when her whole performance finally cracked. The indignation crumbled, the false confusion evaporated, and what was left was just my wife, the woman I'd promised to love and cherish and protect, looking at me with the kind of trapped animal expression that comes when you realize the jig is finally up. "It's not what you think," she said, which has to be the most predictable line in the history of marital confrontations. Right up there with, "We're just friends," and it didn't mean anything. "Then tell me what it is," I said, leaning against the counter with my arms crossed, trying to look casual, while my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife is having an affair, and the man she's having it with sounds suspiciously familiar. Sarah's eyes darted around the kitchen like she was looking for backup that wasn't coming. Her hands were shaking as she closed the dishwasher, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. "I never meant for this to happen," she finally whispered. And those 6 words confirmed everything I'd suspected, but had been desperately hoping was wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. Not the comfortable quiet of a married couple who didn't need words to communicate, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a relationship breathing its last breath. And in that silence, I said the name I'd been dreading to say out loud. "Marcus, have you ever driven somewhere while so pissed off that you can't remember actually getting in the car, starting the engine, or navigating through traffic?" That's exactly what happened the next day after I dropped Chloe off at school and told Sarah I had some errands to run. Errands, right? If confronting your backstabbing brother about screwing your wife counts as an errand, then sure. I was just running errands like some suburban dad picking up dry cleaning and groceries. The drive to Marcus's apartment complex gave me way too much time to think, which was about as helpful as gasoline at a bonfire. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight. I'm surprised I didn't leave permanent fingerprints in the leather. And every red light felt like the universe was giving me more time to imagine exactly what I was going to say to the man who'd spent months systematically destroying my marriage while pretending to be my loving brother. Marcus lived in one of those trendy downtown lofts that cost more per month than most people's mortgage payments. The kind of place that screams, "I'm a bachelor with disposable income and questionable life choices." All exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, probably filled with furniture that cost more than my car and had names like Barcelona chair or mid-century modern something or other. The perfect bachelor pad for a guy who apparently specialized in seducing his brother's wife with fancy dinners and expensive hotels. I'd been to his place maybe 3 times since he'd moved there after his own divorce last year. Sarah had always made comments about how stylish it was, how sophisticated Marcus had become, how different it was from our suburban house with its family-friendly furniture and Chloe's toys scattered around like colorful landmines. Now I realized those weren't just casual observations, they were comparisons. She'd been measuring our life against his and apparently finding ours lacking. The building had one of those fancy intercom systems where you had to be buzzed up. But I'd watched Marcus punch in the code enough times to remember it. Because that's the thing about family. You pay attention to the little details. You trust people with access to your life. You assume that blood means something more than just shared DNA and childhood memories. You assume wrong. As it turns out, the elevator ride to the 8th floor felt like it took about 17 hours, giving me plenty of time to rehearse what I was going to say. I'd run through dozens of scenarios during the drive over. Everything from calm, rational discussions to screaming matches that would probably get the cops called. But standing there in that expensive elevator, listening to jazz music that was probably supposed to be soothing, but just made me want to punch something, I realized that no amount of mental preparation was going to make this conversation easier. Marcus' door was at the end of the hallway behind one of those heavy wooden barriers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I stood there for a moment, fist raised to knock, wondering if there was any chance I was wrong about all of this. Maybe there was some explanation that didn't involve my brother betraying me in the most fundamental way possible. Maybe those text messages were fake. Those hotel receipts were forgeries. And that phone call was some elaborate prank that had gotten way out of hand. But deep down, I knew better. The evidence was too overwhelming, too consistent, too obvious once you knew what to look for. So I knocked on that door with all the enthusiasm of a man walking to his own execution. The door opened and there was Marcus in all his traitorous glory. He was wearing one of those casual button-down shirts that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The kind of outfit that says, "I'm successful and sophisticated," but really just screams, "I have terrible priorities and spend too much money trying to impress people." His hair was perfectly styled. His apartment smelled like expensive cologne. And he had that same cocky smile he'd been wearing since we were kids. The one that used to make me laugh, but now made me want to rearrange his face with my fist. "Hey, bro," he said, like I was there for a social visit instead of to confront him about destroying my family. "This is a surprise. Come on in. Want a beer? I just got this craft brew from some microbrewery in Oregon that supposedly uses hops grown in volcanic soil or some like that." Craft beer, of course, because regular beer wasn't sophisticated enough for a man who was apparently sophisticated enough to steal his brother's wife, but not sophisticated enough to feel bad about it. I stepped into his apartment without saying a word, taking in the space that had probably been the setting for God knows how many romantic encounters with my wife. The living room looked like something out of a magazine. All clean lines and carefully placed accent pieces with not a single family photo or personal touch that might suggest someone actually lived there instead of just posing for interior design photo shoots. "Nice place," I said, and even I could hear the edge in my voice. "Very intimate." Marcus was already heading toward his kitchen, probably to get those fancy beers he'd mentioned, but something in my tone must have registered because he stopped and turned around. For the first time since I'd arrived, he actually looked at me. Really looked at me. And I saw his expression change from casual brotherly welcome to something that looked suspiciously like recognition. "You okay?" he asked. And there was just enough weariness in his voice to let me know that some part of him knew exactly why I was there. "You seem a little tense." Tense, right? I was about as tense as a bowstring being pulled by the Incredible Hulk. And this was going to stand there pretending he didn't know why. "I'm fine," I said, staying right where I was instead of following him deeper into his love nest. "Just wanted to have a conversation with my brother, you know, catch up on things, see what you've been up to lately." The fake smile on Marcus' face flickered like a TV with bad reception. He was smart enough to know that casual brotherly visits weren't really my style, especially not on a random Wednesday morning when I should have been at work. But he was also arrogant enough, or maybe just stupid enough to think he could charm his way out of whatever this was. "Well, you know me," he said with that laugh I'd heard on Sarah's phone. The one that had started this whole nightmare. Same old Marcus. Working too much, dating too little, trying to figure out what the hell I'm doing with my life. Dating too little. Jesus Christ, the balls on this guy. He was standing there talking about his dating life while he'd been systematically dating my wife for months. The sheer audacity was breathtaking in its scope. "Really?" I said, taking a step closer. "Because from what I hear, your dating life has been pretty active lately." That's when the mask finally started to slip. Marcus's casual smile froze in place like someone had hit the pause button on his performance, and I could practically see him running through possible responses in his head. Deny everything. Act confused? Double down on the innocent brother routine. I don't know what you mean, he said, but his voice had lost that confident tone he'd been using since I walked in. Now, he sounded like someone who was trying very hard to sound casual and failing spectacularly. Sarah's phone rang yesterday, I said, watching his face like I was studying evidence at a crime scene while she was at the store. I answered it. The color drained from Marcus's face so fast I thought he might actually faint. All that expensive styling and sophisticated posturing couldn't hide the look of a man who just realized he'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Except instead of cookies, it was his brother's wife. And instead of a slapped wrist, he was looking at the complete destruction of what was left of our family. Oh, he said. And that single syllable contained more guilt than a full confession. Yeah, I said, taking another step closer. Oh, imagine my surprise when some guy started talking about my wife's underwear. Imagine my shock when that same guy said he loved her. And imagine my absolute amazement when I realized the voice belonged to my own brother. Marcus didn't even try to deny it. Maybe he was too shocked. Maybe he was too guilty. Or maybe he was just too arrogant to think he needed to explain himself to me. Instead, he just stood there looking like a deer caught in headlights. If deer wore expensive shirts and lived in overpriced lofts and specialized in destroying their siblings' marriages, I can explain, he finally said, which had to be the second most predictable response in the history of family betrayals right after. It's not what you think. Then explain, I said, crossing my arms and settling in for what was sure to be the performance of his lifetime because I'm really curious to hear how you justify my wife. The word hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I'd said it deliberately, choosing the crudest term I could think of because I wanted him to understand that this wasn't some romantic love story he could pretty up with flowery language and noble intentions. This was betrayal, plain and simple. And I wasn't going to let him dress it up as anything else. Marcus ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for probably the first time since I'd arrived. He looked around his apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. Maybe finally understanding how it would look from my perspective. The setting for his affair with my wife, funded by money from our joint accounts. She needed someone, he said finally. And I almost laughed at the sheer weakness of his opening statement. You work all the time and she was lonely and things just happened. Things just happened. Like adultery was some kind of natural disaster that had struck without warning instead of a deliberate choice made by two people who decided their own desires were more important than my family's stability. You know what they don't tell you about having your life systematically destroyed by the two people you trusted most? They don't mention that afterward you have to keep functioning like a normal human being. You still have to go to work, pay bills, help your kid with homework, and pretend that your entire understanding of reality hasn't just been fed through a wood chipper and set on fire. It's like being expected to perform surgery while someone's hitting you in the head with a baseball bat. Theoretically possible, but not exactly optimal conditions. The drive back from Marcus's apartment was a blur of rage, betrayal, and the kind of cold, calculating fury that comes when you realize you've been played by professionals. His pathetic excuses kept echoing in my head like a broken record. She needed someone. You work too much. We didn't mean to fall in love. Didn't mean to fall in love. Like love was some kind of accident that just happened when you weren't paying attention. Instead of a choice made by two adults who decided that their feelings were more important than my family's stability. The really infuriating part was how he tried to make it sound noble, like he'd been doing Sarah some kind of favor by providing emotional support during her time of need. Emotional support, right? I'm sure all those hotel receipts and expensive dinners were just part of his comprehensive counseling program. Dr. Marcus specializing in adultery therapy with a minor in home wrecking. But here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't just destroy your past. It poisons your future, too. Every memory I had of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and casual Sunday dinners was now contaminated with the knowledge of what had really been happening. All those times Marcus had complimented Sarah's cooking. All those occasions when they'd shared inside jokes I didn't understand. All those moments when I thought I was looking at normal family interactions. It was all performance. A goddamn Oscar-worthy performance that had been playing in my own house. While I sat in the front row, applauding like an idiot, I made a detour on the way home, stopping at a copy shop that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought the height of interior decorating was fluorescent lighting and industrial carpet. The kind of place where people went to make flyers for garage sales and copy their tax documents, not to begin documenting the evidence that would eventually destroy their marriage. But life has a funny way of making ordinary places into the settings for extraordinary disasters. The clerk behind the counter was a kid who looked like he was maybe 19 and had probably never experienced anything more traumatic than running out of energy drinks. He helped me scan every receipt, every bank statement, every piece of evidence I collected, creating digital copies that I uploaded to a cloud storage account Sarah didn't know about. Because if there's one thing I'd learned from this whole experience, it's that people lie, people cheat, and people delete evidence. But digital backups are forever. Next stop was a law office in one of those glass towers downtown that make you feel like an ant, even when you're not dealing with life-altering legal issues. The lawyer I'd found online specialized in divorce and family law with the kind of credentials that cost serious money but promise serious results. Her name was Rebecca Shawn, and her reviews suggested she had a particular talent for handling cases involving adultery and financial deception, which, as it turned out, was exactly the kind of expertise I needed. Rebecca's office was all polished wood and expensive leather, the kind of place designed to make you feel confident about spending your kids' college fund on legal fees. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she'd eaten weaker lawyers for breakfast, and was already thinking about lunch. "Tell me about your situation," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk while she pulled out a legal pad that looked like it had seen more drama than a daytime soap opera. So, I told her everything. The phone call that had started it all, the evidence I'd found, the confrontation with Sarah, the meeting with Marcus. I laid out the whole sordid story like I was presenting evidence to a jury, watching Rebecca's expression shift from professional interest to something that looked almost like sympathy. "How long do you think this has been going on?" she asked, making notes in handwriting that was probably neater than most people's typed documents. "At least 6 months, based on the bank records," I said. "Maybe longer." "They were pretty good at covering their tracks, but not good enough," Rebecca said with the kind of smile that probably made opposing counsel nervous. "Financial records don't lie, and neither do phone logs. You've done excellent documentation work. Most people come in here with suspicions and hurt feelings. You're coming in with evidence." Evidence. It felt weird to hear my destroyed marriage described in such clinical terms, but I was learning that divorce law was all about proof and documentation and turning human disasters into billable hours. Rebecca explained the process: asset division, custody arrangements, spousal support calculations with the kind of professional detachment that would have been comforting if she'd been talking about anyone else's life. "One thing I need to tell you," she said, leaning forward with the expression people use when they're about to deliver news you don't want to hear. "Washington is a no-fault divorce state. The adultery doesn't technically affect the legal proceedings, but the financial deception could be relevant to asset division. No fault meaning it didn't legally matter that my wife had been cheating on me with my brother, using our money to finance their affair, and lying to my face for months. The law apparently considered adultery about as relevant as someone's preference in breakfast cereal, but the money that was different. Spending marital assets on an affair was something the courts actually cared about. We'll need to freeze the joint accounts," Rebecca continued. "And I'd recommend moving half the funds to an account in your name only. Legal, defensible, and it prevents further misuse of marital assets." Marital assets. That's what our life savings had become. Not the money we'd set aside for Chloe's education or family vacations, or the dream house we'd talked about buying someday, but marital assets to be divided and disputed and fought over in conference rooms that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. The next few days passed in a blur of legal preparations and emotional numbness. I opened new bank accounts, changed passwords on everything from our mortgage company to our streaming services, and began the process of untangling a life that had been woven together over 8 years of marriage. It's amazing how complicated it is to separate two lives that have been legally and financially joined. Every credit card, every insurance policy, every shared subscription becomes another thread to be cut. At home, the atmosphere was toxic enough to require hazmat suits. Sarah had moved into the guest bedroom to give us both space to think, which was probably the first honest thing she'd said in months. We maintained a veneer of civility around Chloe, but the silence between us was so heavy it felt like a physical presence in the house. Chloe, bless her innocent heart, kept asking why mommy and daddy seemed sad, why we weren't talking as much, why the house felt different. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother had been cheating on her father with her uncle using money meant for her college fund to pay for romantic getaways? How do you tell a child that the adults she trusts most in the world had been lying to everyone, including each other, for months? Sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to work through. I told her during one of our bedtime conversations, holding her small hand while she curled up with the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2. "But no matter what happens, Daddy loves you very much, and nothing will ever change that. Are you and Mommy going to get divorced like Tommy's parents did?" she asked with the kind of direct honesty that only kids possess. The question hit me like a physical blow. Tommy was a kid in her class whose parents had split up earlier in the year, and Chloe had come home with lots of questions about why some mommies and daddies didn't live together anymore. At the time, Sarah and I had answered those questions together, explaining divorce in the kind of gentle, age-appropriate terms that made it sound like a mutual decision made by adults who still cared about each other but couldn't live together anymore. Now, I was facing the possibility of having that same conversation about our own family. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, because lying to her seemed wrong, even if the truth was complicated. Sometimes marriages don't work out the way people hope they will. But if that happens, it doesn't mean mommy and daddy don't love you, and it doesn't mean anything is your fault. She nodded with the kind of solemn understanding that broke my heart. Kids are resilient, everyone says, but they shouldn't have to be. They shouldn't have to learn about adult failures and broken promises and the ways that people can hurt each other. They should get to believe in forever and trust that the adults in their lives have their together enough to provide stability and security. Meanwhile, Marcus kept calling. Not me. He was apparently smart enough to know that ship had sailed. But Sarah, I could hear her phone buzzing at all hours. See her checking messages when she thought I wasn't looking. The voicemails he left were masterpieces of self-justification and manipulation. Each one saved automatically to the cloud storage where Rebecca could access them as evidence of ongoing contact. I know you're angry, one message said, but what we have is real. Don't let him make you feel guilty for finding happiness. Finding happiness like destroying my family was some kind of noble quest for personal fulfillment instead of a selfish betrayal that had collateral damage in the form of a 6-year-old girl who didn't deserve to have her world turned upside down by adult stupidity. Another message was more direct. I love you, Sarah. Whatever happens with him, that doesn't change. We can get through this together. Together. The word made my stomach churn because it confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't just an affair that was ending now that they'd been caught. This was a relationship, a future they were planning, a life they wanted to build on the smoking ruins of my marriage. You know that moment in movies when the protagonist finally has enough evidence to confront the villain, and they dramatically spread everything out on a table like they're presenting the case to a jury. Well, turns out real life has its own version of that scene, except instead of dramatic music and perfect lighting, you get the fluorescent buzz of your kitchen lights and the sound of your own heart hammering against your ribs like it's trying to escape before the hits the fan. I'd spent 3 days preparing for this moment, organizing every receipt, every bank statement, every call log, and every piece of evidence into neat little piles that told the complete story of my wife's betrayal. Rebecca had helped me create a timeline that read like a manual for how to destroy your marriage in 6 easy steps, complete with dates, dollar amounts, and enough documentation to make a forensic accountant weep with joy. Sarah was in the living room curled up on the couch with a book she'd been pretending to read for the past hour. I say pretending because I'd watched her turn exactly 2 pages in 60 minutes, which either meant she was the world's slowest reader or her mind was somewhere else entirely. Probably planning her next romantic getaway with my brother or figuring out how much of our joint savings she could transfer before I noticed. Chloe was at a sleepover at her friend Emma's house, which meant we could have this conversation without worrying about our daughter overhearing the kind of language that would make a sailor blush. I'd specifically arranged it that way because some conversations require the kind of brutal honesty that 6-year-olds shouldn't have to witness. Sarah, I said, my voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night and every moment of betrayal I'd discovered over the past week. We need to talk in the kitchen now. She looked up from her book with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment, but hoping it would never actually arrive. The kind of look you see on the faces of people who know they're about to be held accountable for their actions and aren't particularly thrilled about the prospect. Can it wait until after I finish this chapter? She asked. Which was probably the most ridiculous stalling tactic in the history of marital confrontations. Like we were discussing dinner plans instead of the complete destruction of our marriage. No, I said, already heading toward the kitchen where I'd spent the afternoon arranging my evidence like some kind of domestic crime scene investigator. It really can't. By the time Sarah reluctantly made her way to the kitchen, I had everything spread out across our dining table like the world's most depressing buffet. Hotel receipts arranged chronologically, bank statements highlighted to show suspicious transfers, phone records with Marcus numbers circled in red ink, and printouts of text message logs that painted a picture clearer than anything Picasso ever created. Sarah stopped in the doorway when she saw the display, her face going through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Shock, recognition, fear, and finally something that looked almost like relief. The expression of someone who'd been carrying a heavy secret and was almost grateful to finally put it down. Sit, I said, pulling out a chair on the opposite side of the table from where I'd been working. Not an invitation, but a command. The kind of tone I'd never used with her before because our marriage had been built on respect and partnership and the assumption that we were on the same team. She sat, her eyes scanning the evidence spread out between us like she was looking at photographs from a crime scene, which in a way she was. These were the receipts and records and documentation of every choice she'd made to prioritize her affair over our marriage. Every decision to spend our money on romantic dinners with my brother instead of our daughter's future. This is everything, I said, gesturing to the papers like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Every hotel, every dinner, every bank transfer, every phone call, the complete record of your affair with Marcus. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for one of the hotel receipts, holding it like it might burst into flames. Her signature was right there at the bottom along with Marcus' proof that they'd been signing in together like some kind of twisted romantic couple. How long have you known? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Since the phone call, I said. But I've been documenting everything since then. Did you know that adultery might not matter legally, but financial deception does? Did you know that spending marital assets on an affair is considered dissipation of assets and can affect property division? She went like I'd slapped her. Good. She should feel uncomfortable talking about the legal implications of her choices because those choices had legal implications that went far beyond hurt feelings and broken trust. I never meant for it to go this far, she said, which had to be the third most predictable response in the history of marital betrayals. Right after, it's not what you think and we can work through this. How far did you mean for it to go? I asked, picking up one of the bank statements that showed a particularly large transfer to Marcus's account. Was there a specific dollar amount where you planned to stop? A certain number of hotel rooms that would have been your limit. It's not about the money, Sarah said, which was exactly what I'd expected her to say and exactly the wrong thing to say while sitting across from thousands of dollars in evidence that it was absolutely about the money. Really? I said, holding up a receipt from that fancy French restaurant where they'd apparently celebrated their 3-month anniversary. Because according to this, you spent $237 on dinner. That's more than we usually spend on groceries for a week. But it's not about the money. Sarah started crying then. The kind of tears that come when you realize you've been caught and there's no way to explain away the evidence. Not the gentle tears of someone who's genuinely sorry, but the frustrated tears of someone who's mad that their secret life has been exposed. You don't understand, she said between soaps. Marcus makes me feel alive again. He pays attention to me. He listens to me. He makes me feel like I'm more than just a wife and mother. More than just a wife and mother. The words hit me like a physical blow because being a wife and mother used to be something she was proud of. We used to joke about being a boring suburban family with our minivan and our mortgage and our weekend trips to Target. When had that become something she wanted to escape from instead of something she wanted to protect? So, this is my fault? I asked, leaning back in my chair and trying to process the idea that my wife's affair was somehow a result of my failures as a husband. I work 50 hours a week to support this family. I come home and help with homework and bedtime stories and weekend chores, and somehow that's not enough attention. You work all the time, she said, like my job was some kind of hobby instead of the thing that paid for our house and our cars and our expensive dinners with my brother. When was the last time we went out to dinner? Just the two of us. When was the last time you surprised me with flowers or told me I looked beautiful? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and I felt something inside me snap. Not my temper, something deeper. The part of me that had been trying to understand her perspective, to find some way to make sense of her choices, to figure out how we'd gotten to this point. When was the last time you told me you loved me and actually meant it? I shot back. When was the last time you kissed me without thinking about him? When was the last time you looked at our daughter and thought about how your choices might affect her future? Sarah's tears stopped abruptly, like I'd flipped a switch. Her face hardened into an expression I'd never seen before. Defensive, angry, and completely unrepentant. Don't bring Chloe into this, she said. This is between us. No, I said, standing up and walking around the table until I was looking down at her. This stopped being just between us the moment you started spending her college fund on hotel rooms. This stopped being just between us the moment you decided that your happiness was more important than her stability. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, I picked it up and glanced at the screen, expecting to see something from work or maybe a message from Emma's mom about the sleepover. Instead, it was from Marcus. A message that had obviously been meant for Sarah's phone, sent to mine by mistake in what had to be the most perfectly timed accident in the history of terrible timing. I love you. No matter what happens with him tonight, that doesn't change. We'll figure this out together. I stared at the screen for a moment, then slowly turned it around so Sarah could see the message. Her face went white as she read the words, probably realizing that her lover had just provided the final nail in the coffin of any chance she might have had of salvaging our marriage. He sent this to the wrong number, I said, setting the phone down on the table next to all the other evidence. But I think the message is pretty clear. You two have been planning this confrontation, haven't you? You've been strategizing about how to handle me finding out. Sarah didn't deny it. She just sat there staring at the phone like it was a smoking gun, which it essentially was. The final piece of evidence that this wasn't just an affair that had gotten out of hand. It was a relationship, a future they were planning, a life they wanted to build together. I want you out, I said. The words coming from somewhere deep in my chest that I didn't even know existed. Tonight, pack whatever you need for now, and I'll have the rest of your things sent wherever you want them. But I want you out of this house, away from our daughter, and out of my life. You can't kick me out, Sarah said, finally finding her voice again. This is my house, too. Actually, I can, I said, pulling out the legal documents Rebecca had prepared for exactly this scenario. Temporary restraining order based on financial abuse and emotional distress. You've got 2 hours to pack and leave, and then you're not allowed back without a court order. The look on Sarah's face when she saw the official letterhead was almost worth the pain of the past week. Almost. She realized that I hadn't been sitting around feeling sorry for myself. I'd been preparing, documenting, and building a case that would protect both me and Chloe from any further damage she might try to cause. Where am I supposed to go? She asked like that was somehow my problem to solve. I don't know, I said. And for the first time in days, I felt something like peace. Maybe Marcus can figure that out. After all, he loves you so much.